it's not just the refugee problem and the asylum problem. We're bringing in far too many people overall that the country simply can't sustain.
Including legal migration.
Well, yeah, we have to, draw a line under any more immigration until such time sort out the housing problem, the health system, and all of the things that people need. It's not right to say to somebody, well, you can come in here to work and we give you a visa and all. You might be able to rent a bed in a room. That's not fair to anybody.
Well, welcome back, everybody. We are here with Cllr Malachy Steenson, who is going to be talking to us about his role in the very influential and significant marches that have taken place over the last several years in opposition to mass migration in Ireland. So it's very good to speak to you today, Councillor.
Thanks for having me, Ben. It's great to be here.
So just a couple of weeks ago now, we saw an absolutely enormous march in Dublin along the lines of the previous marches that have taken place, objecting to a whole variety of things, housing and so on, general discontent, if you want to put it that way. But obviously one of the main issues that is frustrating people that they feel is not being addressed is the immigration issue. And so that was sort of the theme of the march. That's also why there was a counter march, a significantly smaller one, but a march nonetheless in objection to it. And so I'm wondering, that event had at least tens of thousands of people in attendance. Why do you think such significant numbers of people turned out to march on that particular topic?
Well, I think a number of things came together. I mean, we called it the rally at Easter time, both as an Easter commemoration and as a protest against the government. And Easter in Ireland, for a Christian country is a very important time, and for the Irish Republic, it's also a very important time, which is where we remember those who gave their lives, particularly in 1916 and in the generations before that and the decades after that, who gave their lives in the cause of Irish freedom. So we were protesting against almost every government policy that's there. I don't think there's any policies that we actually agree with, whether it's the attempts to shut down debate in this country, whether it's the open borders policy, the lack of an effective housing policy, the disaster that's in the health service, the education policy which is falling apart, all of those things. And it beggars belief that there was a counter-protest effectively saying there's nothing wrong with all of those things, that we're happy enough with the government, because that seems to be what the left are saying, is that, that there's no link between increasing the population and all of these other problems that we have. And clearly, even basic economics will tell you the increase in demand for any service will put pressure on that service. And if you don't increase the service, if you don't build houses and you bring in the past 20 years, around 2 million people, they have to have somewhere to live. And, this government is not, I don't believe there's any intention of solving the housing problem. They're happy enough to allow our young people who have been born and who are here in this country for generations, to emigrate and never come back. And at the same time to import basically cheap labour. And again, it beggars belief that the left is so entrenched in its ideological woke battles that they're doing the very thing that the trade union movement in the early part of the last century was set up to stop, which was the importation of cheap labour into Britain. That's how the trade union movement started, because they saw that bringing in cheap labour from overseas was driving down the cost of wages at the very bottom levels, not at the top, but at the bottom. It's not the doctors and scientists that's coming in, it's people who are coming in to do menial jobs, or in fact, in many cases, not to do any job at all.
Well, if a member of the left-wing opposition was to be here and they were to be responding to this, although I feel they are not too eager to have discussions with the likes of yourself or indeed myself, but if they were to respond to what you just said, I think a lot of them would say, we're not supporting the government's policy. I mean, many of the Sinn Féin counter-protesters who were there, including some Sinn Féin TDs, were holding placards that said no to racism. And they were saying that it's wrong to try and blame the country's housing woes or healthcare woes or infrastructure woes on immigrants who haven't done anything wrong, when really it's a broader systemic failure that's the problem. And this is why they were protesting against the march. It wasn't anything to do with defending the government. It was about pushing back against a racist element that was being expressed in their own view.
Well, they would say that, and I wouldn't give them the title opposition because they've agreed with every government policy that has come in over the past number of years. And not alone that, they've actually, in relation to hate speech legislation, for instance, they've sought harder hate speech legislation, and that's backfiring on them now with the kneecap business. They've demanded that, debate is shut down. They won't debate these things with me. Or with anybody else, and they can call us racist, but I don't care. We're not racist, we're not fascist, we're not even right-wing, we're centrists, and we're saying that you cannot, in a country of our size, with the facilities that we have, we just cannot sustain an increase in population, whether they're black, white, brown, green, or whatever. And that's just a simple fact. A number of years ago, all of these same people were banging on about the Irish homeless people. That problem must have been solved because they never talk about it now. Yet you go down this street here and all the B&Bs are full of either asylum applicants or our own homeless people in emergency accommodation. There are tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people still living in their parents' homes, waiting for their parents either to pop their clogs or, as the government now says, go and get a caravan and live out the back and put your kids into your house. What kind of society is that we're creating, where a government who will prosecute you if you actually, last year, if you put a mobile home in your garden, and as they are doing to people down the country who have put in mobile homes to allow their kids to stay in them, and they were being prosecuted by the planning authorities. And now the government is saying, sure, you can go ahead and do that now because, we think it's a good idea. The very same with modular homes. We were told we couldn't build them to house our own people, but now suddenly we can build modular homes for non-nationals, which cost far more than building a bricks and mortar house, which again beggars belief. But what's systemic in this country is the absolute waste of money. And we hear, we have a Minister for Housing who's effectively said, I'm not capable of doing the job. And the entire government and his own political party agree with him when they say, well, we're going to take the guy from NAMA, pay him twice as much as we're paying you, and he'll sort it out. And we see yesterday, when the sun comes out and they're telling us there's a drought. There's a drought because we haven't built any water infrastructure. We're talking about taking water from the Shannon to Dublin for 20 years. In 20 years, we'll be still talking about it. We haven't built any reservoirs in, I think Pool of Fuca maybe have been the last one, which is probably in the 1960s or thereabouts. We don't have any more, we have a few more waste treatment plants, but we have no more water being saved, despite the population in Dublin, for instance, going from 500,000 to 1.5 million or thereabouts. So there's no joined up thinking. We're talking about building a metro to the airport again for 20 years. We're talking about building a children's hospital, which now will approach probably 3 billion, and God knows when it'll be ready. So there's an absence in this government and in successive governments for over 100 years. Well, probably not 100 years, because when we were poor and stupid, we could do these things. We could build the likes of Finglas. We could build housing estates right around this country, pure social housing. And we seem to have, I wouldn't say lost the ability, but refused. The political class refuses to do this, and they treat housing as a commodity. And that is not a good basis for society. It's not a good basis for society when you look at your parents, say, who could go out and buy a house on one income, get a mortgage and get a house. And, if the second partner worked, then that was for the bits of extras, the holidays or the mobile home down in Skerries or Wexford that a lot of people might have had. But now, even two people working still cannot get a mortgage. Your average doctor and nurse, which was always the couple that was put together, they'd meet in whatever that nightclub used to be called, and that they would have enough to get a decent 3-bedroom semi in some suburban kind of estate. Now, you need about 3 couples to get together to buy a house. And how is that progress?
On the immigration issue again, the Danish model does not get a lot of attention, although I think
because it works.
Well, this is the thing, that the Danes, they're Scandinavians.
They don't have a problem now.
They don't really have a problem, and I mean one of the things that's so interesting about this is the Danes are Scandinavians. They're not exactly ultra conservative, right?
No, they were supposed to be the real liberals.
Yeah, I
through
mean
the years.
they're very liberal in many ways.
They're probably
on a whole
fascist and
variety of
far
issues.
right, according to the left here.
But the Danish Prime Minister, Frederiksen, I believe is her name, she has made it very clear and said explicitly that her goal is to have 0 refugees in her country. And one of the ways they achieve this is their asylum centers, when you go there, they're not horrible. It's not torturous, but it's not particularly pleasant. They don't add in any more comforts or opportunities than are strictly available. And their attitude seems to kind of be, look, if you're fleeing from war, then a warm bed and 3 square meals a day should be enough for you. And if that's not enough for you and you say, oh no, well I want this and I want that and I want these extra opportunities, then you're clearly not...
Probably send them to Ireland.
well, indeed. I'd love to see the figures of how many of them find their way over, but that you're clearly not in enough need of help if you're not willing to accept basics.
Well, you see, I mean, the government itself has admitted at long last that most of the people coming here are economic migrants. They're not fleeing anything other than they want a better life. And I mean, people are entitled to have a better life, but there has to be a rules-based system. I can't just get on a plane and go to Australia or America and say, here I am. You know, you have to have a skill that they want. And if you don't, well, then it's hard luck. You know, and nobody has a problem with that. People abide by the rules. And, you know, but it's not just the refugee problem and the asylum problem. We're bringing in far too many people overall that the country simply can't sustain.
Including legal migration.
Well, yeah, because we have to, you know, draw a line under any more immigration until such time as we sort out the housing problem, the health system, and all of the things that people need. You know, it's not right to say to somebody, oh, well, you can come in here to work and we give you a visa and all. You might be able to rent a bed in a room. You know, that's not fair to anybody.
If I was of, you know, another view, what I might put to you is that the health service would collapse overnight if we didn't have nurses from other parts of the world holding it up. You know, there's so many different industries. How many taxi drivers, how many people working in hospitality? It's
a bit like chicken and egg. We've grown the population and then we're bringing in people to service the growth in the population. You know, and we need to assess that. And it should have never happened. And we have to seriously look at what we're doing. I want to live in a country. I want to live in a nation. I want to live in a place where people are proud of their history, proud of the lifestyle that they have, not to be somewhere that's simply just an economy. And I think, you know, we've spent too long in this country building an economy and badly building it because it's mainly dependent on DFI, which will be gone fairly shortly. And we've never actually built up an industrial base. And we're running down the agricultural base that we have. We're being told you have to get rid of all the cattle because of, you know, methane and all of this nonsense. Yeah, it's okay to import lamb and beef from New Zealand and Brazil and places like that. So none of it actually makes sense. But what we saw in the last rally and what petrifies this government and the political and NGO class is the rise of nationalism, that people are now prepared to stand up and carry a tricolour, which they were afraid to do for years because they were accused of being a Republican. Now you're being accused of being a far-right fascist if you carry your own country's flag. You know, where else would you get that? But people are now proud, and what struck me about the rally was the sea of tricolours. Nothing else, just there was one Donegal flag. But a sea of tricolours. And compare that to the counter demonstration where there were no tricolours, where it was trans flags, it was Palestinian flags, it was hammer and sickles, you know. And I'm sure our American friends will be very impressed to see Sinn Féin standing behind the hammer and sickle, you know, having claimed for years that they were not even socialists, never mind communists, and were appealing to the conservative, traditional Irish voter in America.
What do you think is the reason for the massive disparity we're seeing when it comes to all the discontent with all the issues you just mentioned? Like if we went out in the street right now and we asked 100 people, do you think housing is working? They'd say no. Do you think health is working? They'd say no. Do you think immigration is working? The vast majority of people would say no. We know this from polling consistently over years. Do you think the Irish state is efficient? Do you think spending is working correctly? They'd say no. And yet, we saw an overwhelming return of the government at the last election. The traditional governing parties of Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil, their polling is pretty good. It's not where it was maybe 20, 30, 40 years ago, but they are holding strong for the time being, and the people of Ireland just a few months ago were happy, or seemingly happy, to re-elect them. What do you think is going on here, and what is leading to this?
Well, I think it's temporary for them. And I don't think the people were happy to re-elect them. The people didn't see any alternative. And I think a large part of it was the government started stealing our clothes. They started talking about closing down the borders, or tightening up the legislation and having a fairer system and all of that, and chartering planes to send people back. And we all know that was all waffle. Now, O'Callaghan has chartered, I think, 1 or 2 planes and sent back a couple of dozen people. But, that's purely optics. But I suppose the reality is enough people didn't vote. And in these areas, there's a very low voter turnout. And actually in Dublin Central, it increased in the last general election. But people, I suppose, maybe people aren't hurting enough. Now, people are now hurting now, 6 months later, more than they were. And they can see that this government has no intention of solving any of these problems. And one of the problems that we have in government and in politics in general is that the vast bulk of people who are elected in this country have come through the universities. They're indoctrinated with woke liberalism. And in fact, they don't have any real politics. They just have whatever party they happen to join, and it can be like putting your hand in a lucky bag and just picking a number and saying, oh, there's a gap there, so I'll go for that. And their politics change continually. They've no ideological base. It's just, whatever will get me elected. And then once they get elected, their only focus is on being the nice guy to the boss and getting a ministry down the road and ensuring that they're re-elected. So they never rock any boats. And the system just carries on. And Gript have done huge work on the whole NGO complex, and Eddie Hobbs refers to this as stakeholder capitalism. And it's very clear that all of that put together is what's destroying this country. And, and the same applies in some ways to the church. They're more concerned about what the Irish Times write about them than what's actually going on. And they're afraid of bad publicity. And they don't want the media, who they control, to turn against them. And, they seem to forget that the vast majority of people in this country don't read the Irish Times. I remember having debates and discussions with people, and they'd be terribly concerned about what the Irish Times would write. I'm saying the people you're trying to talk to are reading the Star and the Sun, and they're going to the back page first, so that's where you should be sending your message. But people see politics as something over there that doesn't affect them on one level. And then they see that this government really are just puppets. They just do as they're told by the European Parliament or the European Commissioners. And they'll just, want to be the best boys in the class. And there seems to be, in Ireland, we have a huge inferiority complex. And particularly in the political class, they seem to want to have to prove themselves to others. And I don't think it's as simple as they're looking for a better job somewhere else. I think it's that they feel that they're somehow inferior and they have to be the best boys in the class. We have to have the most liberal abortion laws, the most liberal gay marriage laws, the most liberal of anything. They tried to get rid of the mothers out of the Constitution last year, and they failed abysmally. Now, how an entire political class can call that so wrong and be so convinced that they were going to win those referendums that they didn't even bother campaigning until the end. And how Sinn Féin could come out and say, oh, well, sure, if you voted against it, you're going to have to do it again. I mean, that's what Fianna Fáil do, in Lisbon and Nice, that, you'll keep voting till you give the right answer. Now, I don't think they're going to come back with those referendums, because I don't think they were really too bothered about them in the first place. It was just part of this pretend to be doing something and focus on something and distract the people from what's actually going on.
What do you think are the consequences for Sinn Féin electorally when it comes to calling it wrong on things like the family and care referendums, immigration. I mean, they've changed their tune considerably in recent months on that, but they did have to make a very substantial pivot in the run-up to the election. And hate speech bill, of course. I mean, I had the experience where I was polling people on the street in a journalistic capacity just before the election, saying, what do you think of Sinn Féin, or what do you think of the candidates on option in general? Who are you going to be voting for? And one woman on Moore Street said she had fallen out of love with Sinn Féin. She didn't vote for them. She had voted for them for years. Then in the local elections last year, she didn't vote for them because she thought they'd totally gone off the rails and they'd become a bunch of woke lunatics. But now she's going to vote for them again because, so far as she was concerned, they had righted the ship and they'd learned their lesson, and now they're back to common sense, was her perspective. So they didn't do terribly well in the general election, but they didn't get the trouncing that many people thought they might. What do you think is the long-term consequences?
Had Sinn Féin taken a totally different tack in November 2022, when the immigration issue really began, if they'd have stood with the people in East Wall, they would probably be in government now. They called it wrong, and they continue to call it wrong. I mean, we have last weekend in Carrickmacross, Matt Carty called a meeting, which was a huge attendance at it. But they were basically still saying the same thing, as they're all racist and fascists, and people, rightly pulled them up on that.
They would, if they were here, they would deny that vociferously, and they would say, our position is consistent, that what they say is, from the beginning, they've always said it's about balancing rights. Of course, we have to have a common sense immigration policy. Of course, we can't let anybody walk in willy-nilly, and we have to deport failed asylum seekers and all of that. But we can't allow people to be outright racist and so on. And that's all. We're just calling for balance. That's what they would say.
That's what they would say. But then when you look at, in the part of this island, in the 6 counties where they are in power, they're carrying out the very same policies as the government here that they say they're opposed to. I mean, if you look at the housing problem in the north, it's not quite as bad as in the south, but it's getting there. If you look at all of the other problems, the health service in the north, again, it's a disaster. And, if you look at, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago, when the Supreme Court in Britain said that a woman is a woman, and their health spokesman, Cllr came out and said that's a sensible judgment, we need to look at it here. And I predicted on that day on some programme that would be either former Sinn Féin TD or he will have retracted by tomorrow. Now he had retracted, and now he's dumbed down this weekend, and he says that, a woman can be whatever, So they're flip-flopping, and often their first comment is actually what they believe, and then they're pulled back into line and told, there's what you're supposed to believe. Do as you're told.
If you were the Minister for Justice tomorrow and you were in charge of trying to bring the immigration situation under control, you would run up against a problem which all politicians would run into, which is that we have the famed international obligations that we've heard so much about, which many people malign this and they mock it and they say, oh, sure, that's your excuse for everything. But there is a truth to it in the sense that we are signed up to certain international agreements. Whether we should or we shouldn't be is a whole other discussion, but as it stands, we are. And they are legally binding, and they do require us to, for example, if somebody was to arrive in Dublin Airport and say, hey, I'm an asylum seeker, you have to at least process the claim. It doesn't mean you have to accept them, but you have to let them in temporarily while you check their story, see is it legitimate and so on, and that takes time and investigation, and then months have gone by, and then at that point, if you're satisfied they're not there and they haven't appealed it, then you can get rid of them.
Well, I would disagree on that. I mean, I think most of these things could actually be done in the airport. Most of them are coming in from safe countries. In fact, the bulk of them are coming in from the UK. Now, I know Keir Starmer's a bit of an idiot over there, although he is shifting to our position as of yesterday. Is somebody seriously saying that somebody who's lived in the UK for the past 10, 15 years is somehow entitled to refugee status here? And the answer is quite simply no. And most of the people who are coming in can be processed in the airport. If you don't have documents getting off a plane, well, then you should be immediately put back on that plane because you had the documents getting on. And you've travelled, we've all travelled, and I've never been able to get on the plane anywhere without a passport. So, it doesn't happen. So they should immediately be put back. And when people talk about international obligations, the obligation of any politician in this country and of any Irish national is to this country, not to some far off place or some international kind of thing. And we should withdraw from any of those international obligations or international laws that we've signed. Simply withdraw and say, we are a sovereign state and we are no longer going to abide by legislation or laws or rules that are not to the benefit of our people. And that's quite simple. And we need a government. We need to actually change the whole format of government in this country. We need to get away from, we maybe need to move towards a different style of presidency even, and a totally different style of government, where we have an executive president who can actually employ people to do a job who know what they're actually doing, rather than somebody who will, well, they'll keep that seat safe for us. So, you know, where in the world would you have, for instance, somebody like Jack Chambers as Minister for Finance? You know, the man is barely out of school. Now, he's not Minister for Finance now, but he was. He's public expenditure at the minute. Why would you put him in to almost the most senior position in government? But, I mean, one of the common factors with all of these people, whether it's Varadkar, Harris, Micheál Martin, Chambers, they were all at one stage got elected on the basis that they were anti-abortion, and they suddenly switched and then got the bigger job. So you'd have to wonder, is that a factor in all of that? And they actually campaigned. I mean, we know Harris wrote to the pro-life movement in Wexford and said, you know, I'll be your man, put me in. And he was no sooner in, and he was the biggest advocate for abortion. You know, so these people can't be trusted on any level, you know, on a simple thing like, what's your position on X, Y, or Z? Because if they do it on abortion, they'll do it on everything else.
Well, of course, again, if they were there, I'd just have to give the devil's advocate defense that they would say, look, you know, everybody has views that evolve on a whole variety of issues. I don't agree with me as Ben Scallon. I don't agree with everything I thought 6 months ago. You know, your views do change over time on certain things as you learn new information and you consider things for longer and you have life experiences. So
but then wouldn't the honourable thing to do be to go back to the people and say, listen, lads, I don't believe the things that I believed when you elected me, the things that you thought I believed. So let's have a by-election and see if you want me back. If not, I'll pack my bags. You know, wouldn't that be the honest thing to do, rather than be just trying to scam people, which is what they do.
Well, thank you so much, Malachy. I really appreciate your time.
Great. Thanks, Ben.